Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Mastering Dungeons. I'm Shawn Merwin here with my Spider-Man watching co-host Teos Abadia. Hey Teos.
I am web
Oh,
slinging.
yeah.
Which one of us is what? Yeah, I
We're
watched
we're
Into the
all spider
Spider-Verse.
people.
Man, that is a great, or not Into, it's Across the Spider-Verse. And that is a
Mhm.
fantastic movie. And I had so many thoughts as just from the RPG hobby, let alone
Mhm.
cinema and things like that. But just there are properties that somehow a team shows up and just knocks it out of the park, right? And then there are these properties that you're like, what has happened? And
Mhm.
specifically, what I loved about Spider Verse is that all the things in the previous movie that happened and involved choices and thoughts and were an active thing are rewarded and
Mhm.
important in the sequel, which is exactly what you
Okay.
want,
Yeah.
whether you're dealing with an RPG, a movie, a novel, whatever. Like, you want to be rewarded for what came before
Right.
instead of having those things that mattered and resonated suddenly trivialized. And I don't want to say things like
Mhm.
Star Wars, but like it's just
Okay.
amazing to me whenever I watch a Star Wars film that they seem to not understand what about the Jedi appealed to people. and,
Mhm.
and that's
Right.
yeah, and I had a million other thoughts, but Into the Spider Verse is great. It's treated super well by the folks who are in charge of that, and I can't wait to see. The thing I'd say, my son told me this, which is sort of a spoiler, but I think it's like a necessary spoiler, is it ends on a cliffhanger to go like get ready for part two to this. And I think it's good to know, because if you don't know that,
Nice.
like, I felt better knowing that this was going to end, not with like a, and that's the end of our story.
Okay.
I think it's helpful. So I'm
Yeah.
spoiling that
Cool.
right now for everybody's benefit.
Oh, well, you heard it here maybe first. But actually that ties into our main discussion today, which we will do after our news and listener corner, talking about NPCs and chapter 4 of the DMG, of course, being about creating NPCs and dealing with
Yeah.
NPCs. And some of the things that you talk about with that movie, I think we will sort of get to maybe tangentially when we talk about what chapter 4 does for us as DMs and maybe what it doesn't do
Mm, yeah.
for us. So
Fantastic.
good lead in there. First, let's go to our listener corner to hear from our listeners. Coming to us first via Mastodon is Pole Jack. So, adventure fiction gaming dominates the market, but it is only a small part of what tabletop RPGs are capable of. What games, if any, interest you outside of the adventure fiction genre and why? Examples: mystery like Brindlewood Bay, melodrama like Pasiones, tragedy like Ten Candles, romance like Breaking the Ice and Hot Guys Making Out, children's literature like Yaziba's Bed and Breakfast, drama like Hillfolk, exploration like Ribbon Drive and The Quiet Year and Wonder Home. And as a follow-up, what do you think you'll ever cover such games on the show? Aside from briefly touching on the non-combat possibilities of Fate, all the games you've discussed so far have been firmly in the adventure fiction genre, which makes sense given its popularity, but I also wonder if you had any interest in branching out. So to answer the second one first, uh, the name of this podcast is Mastering Dungeons, and it's Mastering Dungeons for a reason. That said, I know I can speak for Teos when I say we love role playing games of all shapes and sizes. I don't want to talk about a game, however, unless I've not just played it, but played it extensively enough that I understand the game behind the game, that I understand the nuances of it and can discuss it. And that's not the case right now. So, would we like to? Absolutely. When will that happen? When either you or I or the people we bring on get to the point where we can talk about it intelligently. Now, I'm planning on going to more and more conventions as the year ends and then the new year begins. And when I do, I want to play these games. If I'm not running D&D or a similar, adventure type game, I want to play these other games, but they're hard to find. If I try to go to Gen Con right now, unless I was sitting there hitting the button as the event management system kicked on, I'm locked out of a lot of the games that I would have loved to try. So we're working on it.
Yeah.
It's just not easy to do.
And I think we try to pick for the show games that we think the listener who is really a D&D kind of listener can easily apply to their game and make their game better. And sometimes games provide sort of similar things. So like Fiasco is a really neat experience, and I think everybody should try it. But it is almost as applicable to provide the advice that I could provide from Fiasco with things like relationships building through something like Fate, right? And that's what made Fate like such a good choice, is that it covers a lot of the tips that you might get out of other games as well. And Pasión de las Pasiones, I'm currently reading. I like to keep it on my bedside as my own, just makes myself laugh when I go to bed and I see, this hot romance looking cover on there. But it is, an apocalypse world based game. And so it was easy to cover that through a lens of Dungeon World rather than a telenovela romance game. But yeah, I mean, I agreed, Shawn. Like, right, I want to play all the games and I want to have all the experiences, and I need someone to run all these things for me, and I need more time in my life. But yeah, I mean, I do, and later, there was another Mastodon post that Poljack made about comedy games, right? Things like Toon. And it's great, and I think that is, for anyone listening, like, it is fantastic to try all these things, because it does help you to understand how differences in writing and rules can change the experience that you have, and you can often apply that to any other game you're playing. But yeah, I think my main problem here is time.
Yeah. And I cover certain games in the class I teach. I cover Fiasco, and I cover some of the smaller games, Lasers and Feelings, and what was the bear one, a Honey Feist.
Yeah.
Right. So those sorts of games we could talk about, but there's only so far we could go in tying that back to the D&D theme that we sort of build ourselves up from. So yeah, there you go.
Yeah, like, I was looking at the rules for Girl by Moonlight, which Evil Hat is crowdfunding right now. And that's one of like, that sounds really interesting, and I would love to check it out. And I'm thinking, when will I do so?
Yeah.
Go
Before I started working full time for Ghostfire, I worked with a group called Encoded Designs, who many of the other members are more into those different games like the ones mentioned than D&D. So I got to dip my toe into editing adventures or editing games that are built on those sort of mechanics, and it's great fun, and it's great learning. I just haven't been able to do that for the last 2.5 years, so it makes it harder.
And maybe I'll mention real quickly, because this is a topic I thought about bringing up for this episode, but so I'll just mention really quickly that on RPG Geek, there is a thread that was mentioned on our Discord about Gen Con, where Bruce McGee yearly posts since 2013 the number of seats available at Gen Con for each RPG. And I actually made a table of comparing all of the data and looking at it. And there were some really neat discussions we had around this, because one of the things is there's a lot of games being added now, and more support for various RPGs than there ever has been before across the years. And so it's really interesting to see just like how many opportunities you have to play. And I know that when I was going to Gen Con regularly, I would try to get in like a paranoia game, and there would be like 2 tables running, and now it's a lot better.
Right.
And same for a lot of these other RPGs. That's not just the few big ones that have a ton of tables. There are a lot more seats that one could possibly get into. Now there are a lot more people, so you may still not score it, but there are a lot more opportunities to try different games. And that's great. That's a really nice thing to see.
Yep. Next, we have Dr. Nick via Patreon, who asks, I would love to hear the two of you talk about the differences in power and flexibility between martial and caster characters. You've discussed on past episodes how it's good to have variability in the simplicity of characters. How do you feel about differences in capability? Is it a problem? If we assume it's a problem, how would you fix it? That's a huge question. That's a lot of huge questions, actually, all in one. So let me pull out 4 specific words from this question: power, flexibility, simplicity, and capability. So power and flexibility are two, not the only lenses you can look at a role-playing game through, but good lenses to look at characters in a role-playing game. Look at them through. So they can be two different things, power and flexibility can translate into power, and in fact, it often does translate
Mhm.
into power. So let's step all the way back and say something, sort of set the ground rules for this. At the end of the day, the point of the game of D&D, not the storytelling vehicle, but the game mechanics themselves, are you reduce your enemy to 0 hit points before they reduce you to 0 hit points. Is there more to the game than that? Absolutely. But at its base, the game that we open a book and read, that's what it does. If you can do that, you win. If you fail to do that, you lose. So, what is power in a game? One way to define it is the ability to reduce enemies to 0 hit points or stop your enemies from reducing you to 0 hit points. That's power. If you can do those things in whatever combination, you'll have a powerful character. Flexibility is having the resources at hand for your character to have different ways to do that. Because sometimes the way you would normally reduce your enemy to 0 hit points, by hitting it with spells and they fail their saving throws, are not available to you because they automatically make their saving throws, or they automatically don't take damage from magic, or whatever you have. So then you need the flexibility to be able to have power in a different way.
Yeah.
So, those are ways that you can look at the game. Just as a caster, by definition, you have spells, and that adds flexibility to your character generally by default. So if you're inherently more flexible, you have more power. Thoughts?
Yeah. So there are games where essentially your spell casting is I do ball of fire with X damage, right? And that's what it is. And it's not a lot of text. I impede you. I subtract dice from your pool, and that's what my spell does, right? It's a debuff, but it's a very simple debuff. And it's really interesting. I was looking at some older editions last week and thinking to myself how often a spell really had this wide ranging, and it came because I was looking at concentration, and I was thinking about how concentration really caps what an enemy can do to you. That and you can do to an enemy, but especially what an enemy can do to you. Where like, yeah, maybe the enemy can cast Globe of Invulnerability, but they can't also layer on all these other protections. It's sort of the only protection they get to do, and if they get hit, they might lose it and have to spend a whole round trying to protect themselves again. And that is so different than the earlier game that gave these swinging wild capabilities, but made it so you were really bad at dealing damage as a caster. So you needed those numbskulls who would come in with the hammers and the axes and the blades and really tear into them. And that was the weird way that the game had to work. And it was really around third edition that the spellcaster suddenly dealt massive damage too, not with the one fireball they had in a day, but with continued numbers of options, summoning monsters or dealing their own damage or whatever. And suddenly they were forces too, and in fact, too strong, right? Like really too strong. Because all the abilities they had, even at mid levels, but especially at high levels, and the game was almost an on-off switch of wild spikes between spellcasting sides, with then the constancy of the damage output of the melee characters. Fourth edition changed all of that, right? It said attacking with your weapon, your storm of blades or your wild arc of your axe is just like the fan of flames coming out of your hands and all that sort of stuff. And some people really complained, right? Because it was suddenly really similar to compare those, right? When you break it down, it was a lot more like those RPGs that say it's a fireball, it's a debuff ball, it's a whatever. And that's the hard part, right? Is that you want the game and the audience wants these things to feel different. But that means that spellcasting is this giant complex beast that's problematic. And we can see how 5th edition struggles with that. It tries to create concentration, but that is its own problem. I mean, if 5th edition, if 2024 were to say, we're going to get rid of concentration, I would say, great. That's a totally viable thing to do. But you're going to have to do a bunch of other things to then make it work. Right? Because it is this problem. And any number of other things could be done to try to address this. But it's one of those things that when you mess with it, everything else has to be messed with too, because it's such a problem. I don't know. Yeah. So
I mean, and we could, we could talk about all different sorts of things in here, and this doesn't even get to the simplicity issue, right?
Yeah.
The simplicity issue that we're talking about is there are some players that are more than happy to give up flexibility, but they don't want to give up power.
Yeah.
They don't want to contribute less to the game because the character that they play is simple. And that's, I think, what we're talking about when we say, we want complex martial characters. We want simple martial characters. We want complex casting characters. We also want simple casting characters. We want people to say, I want to play Gandalf.
Right.
But I don't want to have to read through 50 spells and make these choices both while I'm creating the character and at the table. I want to cast my bolt of fire or my cone of cold. And that's the choice I make rather than
I think
trying to think too deeply.
5th edition is very clear in what it tried to do at the outset, right? You can look at the champion fighter, and it's so clear how it's trying to be very simple, not muck it up, not add lots of functionality. When you roll a certain number, you crit, and it deals huge amounts of damage, and that's the fun of it, and that's what they're trying to do it. And the sorcerer was also about you only get but so many spells and you do them a bunch, and it was a little more complicated in 3rd edition, which 3rd edition was really quite fine-tuned it even further. And now we're changing that, and so the dynamic of all of it starts to change when the simplest builds are actually fairly complex. And is that where the game is headed? I don't think it is. So that's why we end up talking about in this show, right? Is because you see the audience is actually moving primarily towards a more open, more narrative style, but the game seems to be giving you more crunch, and that's a bit of a disconnect that you have to watch.
For sure. So I hope that sort of partially answers that question. And I'm sure as we look at more previews and play tests of the upcoming 2024 game, we'll have more to say about that as well. But we can now get on to our news and our commentary, where we will start with DriveThru and Roll20 having some news for us. Earlier this year, Roll20 allowed DM's Guild creators to sell their D20 versions. And starting in June, DriveThru will be doing the same. You'll be able to sell a product on DriveThru and also sell the Roll20 version, so you can bundle them together or sell those options separately. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's neat. Like, I've been noticing the Dragonlance Adventures League adventures that are really quite good. I got to play them at Winter Fantasy. They have a bundle, right? And there's a link in our show notes. You can check it out, where you have on one page the ability to buy the DM's Guild version and the Roll20 version all in one if you want it for slightly more, or you can buy just the one, right? Depending on which platform you're on. And so you get that nice choice of bundling it together and getting both versions if you're going to run it online. So now you can do that no matter where you're publishing. It doesn't have to just be the DMs Guild. It can be any OBS site, and now you can do the same thing. And that's good news for creators who want to have that expansion into the Roll20 side and where your product seems like it would work well. Though, we covered in our interview where we interviewed the Roll20 folks, it is hard as a creator to make your money back on the time it would take, or that it does take, to create a really great Roll20 version of, say, an adventure. And so that is, I think, the biggest impediment. You now have the ability to do this. Will you profit from it is a good question, right? I think if you are very good already at creating things in Roll20, then that may be the case. But hiring someone is often expensive, So it's a tough piece that I hope over time they'll make it easier to create your Roll20 version, and then it will really sing.
Yeah, we had this issue with Fantasy Grounds and the DMs Guild earlier, in the career of DMs Guild and the lifespan of DMs Guild, because once they allowed it, everyone kept asking, "Oh, is there going to be a Fantasy Grounds version? Are you going to make a Fantasy Grounds version?" And the question was asked not with the, "Is it worth it for you?" It's, "We demand it, and you are an idiot if you don't put it up."
Sure.
And so I hired someone to create the Roll20 version, or the Fantasy Grounds version, but I couldn't sell it separately. It had to and you couldn't charge more. It just had to be added. So there was no way to determine if people were buying it for Fantasy Grounds or for the PDF. And so you're paying a lot to get it done. Then you don't know if you're getting your money back on that. Plus, the DMs Guild and Wizards is still getting their cut. So even if somebody was buying it for Fantasy Grounds, you are the one paying the person to do it, and Wizards of the Coast and are getting their normal percentages. It didn't make much sense. This at least allows you as the creator to move things around and get a better idea of if you are getting your money back on making this worthwhile.
Definitely great for Roll20, because I think Roll20, it's a good way for them to tout their marketplace and add more to the marketplace, encourage more people to be on that marketplace and develop those skills. But I want to see more from the infrastructure support side to make it cheaper, easier to create this.
Yep. I got a chance to play on Roll20 again with my high school group who has started playing once every couple weeks, and I'm not DMing, I'm playing, but even the people that stopped playing with AD&D are now playing again, and with Roll20's help, we were busting through the Sunless Citadel really quickly. It was going real fast. Everybody was happy. We could see it. It was great. It just shows how important these virtual tabletops have been to the rebirth of the gaming craze.
Sure.
We also have news on D&D Pride shirts and hoodies. The Magic the Gathering Pro Shop has now been updated with Magic the Gathering and D&D gear themed for Pride Month, with all the profits going to the Trevor Project, aiming to end suicide among LGBTQ plus young people. So you can check that out at magicthegatheringproshop.com/pride. Tell us about Sharkadia.
Yeah, I'm a little behind on this because issue 28 of Arcadia just came out by MCDM, which is the penultimate episode. And issue 28 is fantastic. Issue 27 is really very special, called Sharkadia instead of Arcadia. And it gives you all kinds of stuff that's nautical and sharky themed. You have an amazing campaign adventure by Willie Abeel, who is just such a good designer. Bolstered by really cool shark monsters that James Introcaso himself wrote, and then rules and monsters by Gwendolyn Marshall. And It is really good. And if you're at all curious about that, covering it in way more depth than we could is Jared Rasher, who brings, dare I say, fathoms of depth, Shawn, to the term in depth.
Mhm.
And so we've linked in the show notes to his article on whatdoiknowjr.com, where he reviews all about what this contains. And it's very good. It is a fantastic issue, really cool. Like, you read this issue and you're just like, great, I want to run a campaign off of these things. And I could run a campaign based on these things. Highly recommended.
Yeah, Arcadia. Yeah, Arcadia, great. This issue, great as well. And just Jared Rasher, if you haven't read his reviews, if you want to see a review of something before you buy it, Jared is one of the most in-depth reviewers out there. His reviews are great as well. Yep. We also hear from DM David on the Astral and the Ethereal. This is a look at the history of these two planes, pop culture references and influences from each, how they are often can be or are used interchangeably, and how they have slowly differentiated over the editions. It also looks at why they may still be redundant, and DM David proposes changes to help them become easier to use during play.
Yeah, it's great. If you enjoyed when we talked about the Astral and Ethereal as part of the DMG review a few episodes ago, he talks about, like, why did these things show up? And it has to do with things like Doctor Strange talking about the Astral, or the sort of 70s new age movement, and just this, but there wasn't a lot to them. And then over time, rather than remove one of them, they start trying to explain why there are two different versions, and what their differences are, which often end up not having much play, because you just transport yourself to the actual plane you're going to, rather than maybe going through one of these. So it's really a great analysis. He does such good historical breakdowns of how everything comes together and what the influences were, and then what to do with that. I love this article. Vintage DM David.
There you go. And several crowdfunding or interesting releases have come up since the last time we were able to get down deep into them. The first, of course, being Cobalt Press and Tales of the Valiant role-playing game. I think it did well over 500,000 on the first day, and they've got to be approaching 1 million by now. And by the end of it, I would be very surprised if they weren't closer to 2 million than the 1 million. For me, this is a very, very, very smart business decision. They can capitalize on the hate that Wizards has been getting. They can get out ahead of the unknown of what 2024 is going to bring, whether what Wizards does is going to be loved or hated, whether it's going to be accepted or rejected, whether it's going to be very close to current 5e or very different from current 5e. So to get out ahead of all that unknown with something that people can put their finger on and say, well, at least we know what this is a brilliant business move. So congratulations on a very successful Kickstarter so far, and will of course be a very successful Kickstarter when it ends. Got nothing to add to that?
I'm very happy for them.
You have too much to add to that.
Yeah, I'm very happy for them. I struggle with how many. There's so many thoughts in my mind about how many versions of D&D that are very much like D&D but slightly different there are, and I'm very curious to see kind of where these go long term. I have no doubt that some of them can crowdfund in enormous values, and that's great for those companies. They deserve it, but I don't know where it'll end up. I'm very curious. I'm shocked. I guess I'm historically shocked by how much outrage there is and remains around D&D. Not that it's not deserved, but I don't see this as being fundamentally different than things that Wizards has done before. So I guess maybe I I have too many scabs and then I'm deadened to it. But I'm surprised that like the conversations I hear wherever I go, it can be, a poll on Reddit, it can be on Twitter if I go there, it can be on Mastodon, it can be Discord channels. Like folks are really questioning how tied they want to be to D&D. It's really fascinating to see. And so I'm very curious where they go. I think Cold Press has done a pretty good job of not being too hard on exploiting the anger. They're doing what they're doing and they're clearly helped by it, but they're not fomenting it, which I appreciate.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's reasonable, and that hasn't been the case with companies in the past. Where they've really tried to push it, and make it actually fan the flames, build the fire.
Sure.
So I appreciate that they haven't done that. And also, I think the one last thing is something that I even mentioned when I was at the D&D summit to the D&D folks there, which is that it is something to see the companies that are in theory the biggest, and we'll talk about this for more further, but the biggest partners, your biggest partners, are breaking away. And that is something that I think Wizards should pay close attention to, right? Like if any of us saw our friends just go off and do things that aren't really in our interest, well, maybe we weren't treating them well, right?
Yeah. Well, and part of the brilliance of this move is they being Cobalt Press can make their $2 million on this one thing. And if it turns out that the pendulum swings as it generally does, and people forget, all of the things that Wizards has done, and 5e 2e becomes a huge success, Cobalt Press can just go, well, okay, everything that we make is compatible with that, so here you go. And they don't lose anything in the translation. So I don't see it as being dangerous at all to their overall business. So yeah. We also have some new content from Evil Hat, as Teos mentioned earlier. Girl by Moonlight. Girl by Moonlight explores the heartbreak of denying who you really are, fighting for what you believe in, and the transcendent power of building relationships while embracing your true self. So what do you think of this RPG that you took a quick look at?
Yeah, it's really cool. It uses the concept of a magical girl as a sort of shorthand, but you don't have to be a girl to be a magical girl necessarily. And it's really around people whose identities put them at the margins of society. And everything about the game, and there's a free 50-page preview available. It's really worth checking out, just to even look at the design ideas in it, let alone get excited for the actual product that you can back. It is all about this theme, right? Of the idea of like, who are you? What is it that you are dealing with in your everyday life? And how do you take action to resolve it? And then coming together as a group to do those things and deal with the issues that you're up against, which is really cool, right? Perfect. Like this is the kind of game I'd like to just, hand out free at every high school, right? Like, and it's only $15 in PDF. $30 bundled with Roll20, $30 for hardcover plus PDF. So it is really affordable. Excellent to check out.
From MCDM, speaking of Arcadia, we now get a new version of the Illrigger for playtesting. This is a Hell-inspired character class that has been revised by Mario Ortegon and Sadie Lowry. Yeah. You can get that at mcdmproductions.com.
I did not get a chance to look at it yet, but it is on one of my browser tabs, and I'm excited to dig into it, especially because I love the work that Mario and Sadie do. So, looking forward to that.
Yeah. Yep. And the last bit of news that we didn't get to last week, but was pretty well talked about, was the Critical Role and Darrington Press release of the game Candela Obscura. A free preview PDF is made available, and they did a new stream using the system to show the actual play of the game. when people began to read it and see it, there were many comments online about it being very reminiscent, i.e., are we playing the same game as Blades in the Dark? And the response was for Darrington Press to re-release the free PDF with another page that gave a nod to not just Blades in the Dark, but some other sources that it took inspiration from. What it did not include, this free PDF, was the 2 sentences that you needed to put to be a licensed subproduct, if you will, of Blades in the Dark, a licensed version of those rules. Now, will they add it to the final book? Maybe, maybe not. We don't know yet. But if they don't, that then becomes an interesting question of how much like a game does another game need to be to raise some eyebrows
Yeah.
if they don't use the licensing that's freely available to do that.
And people are very kind to Critical Role, which is, I mean, deserved, right? But there's something to be said for the space that is occupied by an entity. You as a small creator can't just say like, "Hey man, you stole my system," right? Or what are you gonna, what's up with this? And they clearly, the communications Critical Role and Matt Mercer saying that they're in talk with John Harper, who created Blades in the Dark, and that he's working to do something with them. And that's all good, but it's like, wow, you made an RPG that is sort of your first, no, not sort of, it's the first RPG you're releasing to the public to say, hey, look, we can do RPGs as well. And it's like another game. Like, I wonder if that was really like, I'm curious whether everybody at Critical Role really understood that the game had these similarities, or if that was just in the person that they're paying to write it for them. Because if Wizards did this, people would be lighting the whole place on fire, right? Even if the creator said, no, it's fine, and I'm okay with it, as they're doing in this case. So there's a bit of a double standard here with Critical Role getting a pass, and really interesting legal ground, right? Where you are choosing to release something that could make a lot of money, that uses an approach in another system to this extent. I'm very interested to see how this plays out over time.
Yeah. I mean, I'm fine with it because legally there's a license there that you can use. And
Except they're
the
not using it.
license doesn't say you have to pay. Well, exactly. That's the thing. And to use it, you just have to add 2 sentences to your book that says this is made under this license. And so I just assumed that in the final version that they would do that. I didn't see the original version without the attributions. I just saw it say,
version.
We took this from these people. We recognize this. We're talking with them. They're okay with it. And then I saw tweets that basically said the same thing. So I just was like, I didn't even know that there was. Now, if they put out a final version and don't at least put those 2 sentences in, then I'm like, yeah, you're taking someone else's game.
Yeah, and what would happen if I were to launch an RPG that uses Candela Obscura in some way, right? Like, I don't think that's okay. And I know that people will say like, oh, you can't copyright mechanics and so on, but I mean, yeah, to an extent, but I would like to see our hobby operate in a better way of if you're going to use something that's in another game, talk to those people, right? They did that work.
Yep. And in our show notes, you can see links to both the quick start rules that were released for free and the actual play game using those rules. And we will keep an eye on this for reactions and how well the game plays and what people think of it when it is finally fully released. And that's it for our news.